Hello, boys and girls. I'm Teacher T. Let's get ready for some fun stories and lots of learning. Let's explore this magical world of David's party. David's party. David was playing in the garden and Dad was trying to cut the grass. Then he called David. David, will you go and telephone Mr. Small and ask him if I can borrow his garden shears, please? Said Dad. All right, said David, and off he went into the house. Now, who did Dad want me to telephone? He thought. Oh, yes, it was Mr. Tall. So he telephoned Mr. Tall and asked him if Dad could borrow his garden chairs. Why does your dad want to borrow my garden chairs? Asked Mr. Tall. I don't know, said David. Perhaps we're going to have a party. All right, said Mr. Tall. I'll bring the chairs round, but go and telephone Mrs. Green and ask her if you can borrow her table. So David went to look for the telephone number. Now, who did Mr. Tall want me to telephone? He thought. Oh, yes, it was Mrs. Brown. So he telephoned Mrs. Brown and asked her if Dad could borrow her stable. Why does your dad want to borrow my stable? Asked Mrs. Brown. I don't know, said David. We're having a party. Perhaps our garden is too small for a party. All right, said Mrs. Brown. I'll get the stable ready, but go and telephone Mr. James and ask him for some big tablecloths. So David went to look for the telephone number. Now, who did Mrs. Brown want me to telephone? He thought. Oh, yes, it was Mr. Jones. So he telephoned Mr. Jones and asked him if Dad could borrow some big plates and mops. Why does your dad want to borrow some big plates and mops? Asked Mr. Jones. I don't know, said David. We're going to have a party in Mrs. Brown's stable. Perhaps the plates are to put food on and the mops are to mop the stable. All right, said Mr. Jones. I'll bring them round. But go and telephone Mr. Baker and ask him to bring some bin bags. All right, said David, and he went to look for the telephone number. Now, who did Mr. Jones want me to telephone? He thought. Oh, yes, it was the baker. So he telephoned the baker and asked him to bring some big buns. We're going to have a party in Mrs. Brown's stable, and Mr. Jones is going to bring some mops and plates, he said. Perhaps the buns are to go on the plates. All right, said the baker. I'll bring the buns round. Now go and get ready for the party. So David went to get ready. When he came down, Dad was waiting for him. What have you been doing, David? He asked. Mr. Tall has brought me some chairs. Mrs. Brown has telephoned to say that her stable is ready. Mr. Jones has brought some mops and plates, and the baker has brought lots of buns. All I wanted to do was cut my grass. So David told Dad all about his telephone calls. Oh dear, said Dad. I wanted to borrow some shears, not some chairs. What are we going to do with all these things? I know, said David. Let's have a party after all. Thank you for joining me on this amazing tale. If you enjoyed the story, please don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel for more fantastic adventures.